At 2:28 a.m., the Strait of Hormuz lay in total darkness. Black water, no wind, no moonlight, only the steady mechanical thrum of a carrier strike group holding its position in one of the most volatile passages on the planet. Just 21 miles of disputed water, where nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes through, and where American and Iranian forces have spent decades circling one another in a slow, tightly wound standoff that the world hopes never escalates beyond control. At 2:29 a.m., something cuts through the dark. Low, fast, barely above the surface, so close that the rotor wash throws seawater into the air. A H-1J Cobras, running dark, no lights, no transponders, no radio chatter, race in from the northwest at top speed, brake hard, vanish into the radar shadow of the coastline, then emerge again even nearer. The crews say nothing. Every move is precise, every action drilled so many times it no longer feels practiced. It feels automatic. At 2:21 a.m., they strike. The night erupts. Across the carrier group, every defensive sensor reacts at once. Radar operators suddenly pick up a dozen fast-moving contacts approaching from multiple directions. Threat displays flare red. Officers call out bearings and positions. In an instant, the full defensive focus of the strike group, every set of eyes, every system, every decision-maker, is pulled outward toward the attack, toward the confusion, toward the immediate danger demanding attention right now. At 2:22 a.m., the ropes fall. Fast ropes descend from the darkness above onto the flight deck of a United States aircraft carrier. Then the operators come down them, fast, controlled, and exact. Boots slam onto steel. They spread out immediately, covering sectors and pushing toward assigned positions with the cold efficiency of men who have repeated this sequence so often it no longer passes through thought. No hesitation, no disorder, only momentum moving across the deck of one of the most powerful warships ever built. By 2:24 a.m., 200 Quds force operators are on the deck. And for one brief, charged, almost unreal moment, everything unfolds exactly the way it was meant to. To understand how that moment could happen at all, you first have to understand what the Quds force really is. This is not a conventional military formation, and it is not a typical special operations unit. It is the overseas action branch of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The tool Tehran relies on when it wants results beyond its borders, delivered with precision, plausible deniability, and maximum impact. These are operatives shaped by years of work across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. They have managed proxy networks, overseen covert missions, and coordinated allied militias across several regions at once. They are patient, highly skilled, and deeply experienced. And in the weeks leading up to that night, they had been studying everything. The carrier strike group had been moving through Hormuz in a recognizable pattern. Every shift was recorded, every radar emission was examined, every defensive formation was broken down, measured against doctrine, compared with past behavior, and tested against expected response models. Then they found the detail that seemed to change everything. There were gaps, not random ones either. Clean, recurring, almost surgical breaks in the carrier's radar coverage. Certain sectors dropped out at regular intervals. Windows appeared and vanished with a rhythm that felt too consistent to ignore. Their analysts checked the data again and again. The openings were real, verified, usable. What looked like a structural weakness in one of the most advanced naval defense systems in the world appeared to be sitting there in plain sight, waiting to be exploited. From that point, the plan almost wrote itself. The Cobras would move first, not to inflict maximum damage, but to overwhelm and divert, forcing the carrier's defenses to focus outward. At the same time, high-speed attack boats would surge in from several directions, stretching the threat picture wider and wider, forcing commanders to divide their attention across too many problems at once. Inside that first minute of confusion, inside that carefully calculated window, the ropes would drop, the boarding team would descend, and the real objective would begin. Reach the aircraft on the flight deck, disable them, turn the carrier from the dominant force in the area into a massive, exposed target stranded in contested waters. It was bold. It was precise. And from 2:22 to roughly 2:26 a.m., it seemed to be unfolding exactly as planned. By 2:26 a.m., the operators were moving toward the aircraft. Calm, deliberate, fully locked in, each second counting louder in their minds. The Cobras were still holding the defenders' attention, the speedboats were still pressuring the perimeter, the opening was still there. They were perhaps 90 seconds away from starting the real damage, 90 seconds from turning an extraordinary infiltration into a full-scale strategic crisis for the United States Navy. And then, for just a moment, if you were one of those operators, if you could think clearly through the rush of adrenaline, something should have felt wrong. Why was there no serious resistance at the point of entry? Not reduced resistance, not delayed resistance, none at all. The gaps in radar coverage were clean, too clean. Their shapes felt designed, almost engineered. The defensive reaction to the Cobras was real, but it was also flawless in its timing. Perfectly aimed, precisely calibrated to draw attention away from the exact sectors needed at the exact moment required. Real defenses under pressure rarely behave that way. When genuine systems begin to fail, they fail unevenly. Backups activate. Officers improvise. Overlapping layers create confusion. Responses become messy, unpredictable, human. But this looked different. It looked less like a defense collapsing under stress, and more like a defense that had already chosen where it wanted to focus. A vulnerability is something you discover. A trap is something you are invited to see. At 2:27 a.m., the horizon breaks open. A 10 Thunderbolt IIs appear. Not glamorous aircraft, not sleek, not the kind used in promotional footage, but built around devastating 30mm rotary cannons capable of tearing a helicopter apart in seconds. They come in from beyond visual range, where they had been waiting in wide, patient holding patterns since before the Cobras ever crossed the line. The pilots already know exactly where to go. The Cobras that had served as the distraction are now exposed and isolated, their support already gone before they realize it. The A-10s sweep through the airspace with cold efficiency. In less than a minute, the Cobras are engaged and destroyed. The air cover the boarding force depended on is simply gone. At 2:28 a.m., the AH-64 Apaches arrive. They move in low and tight, forming a perimeter around the carrier that closes every helicopter approach route at once. They are not there to engage in a drawn-out battle. They are there to seal the area completely, to ensure that nothing with rotors reaches that flight deck from any direction under any circumstances. The sky above the carrier, chaotic and contested only moments earlier, is now controlled with absolute clarity. The operators on the deck are suddenly, unmistakably alone. 30 seconds later, the flight deck lights switch on. All of them. The entire deck floods with harsh white light, transforming what had been a shadowed, confusing battleground into a fully illuminated stage where every person, every position, every movement can be seen instantly from every angle. The psychological impact is immediate. Darkness gives attackers confidence. It suggests concealment. It creates the belief that movement is possible, that options remain, that the outcome is still undecided. The light strips away that illusion instantly. The moment those lights flare on, every operator on that deck understands the reality at the same time. This is no longer an assault unfolding in darkness. It is exposure, total and undeniable. At 2:29 a.m., the sea route's close. The escort ships positioned along the outer edge of the strike group have been shifting quietly throughout the entire engagement. Small adjustments, almost invisible in the moment, but deliberate. Now, they finish the move. The gaps the speedboats used to break through are gone. The outer perimeter has hardened into a wall, a real naval barrier with no openings, no weak seams, no uncovered approach left to exploit. Nothing is getting out by water. Nothing is getting in by water. In every direction at once, the boarding force is cut off. At 2:30 a.m., the carrier begins locking down internally, corridor by corridor, hatch by hatch. Teams move along pre-planned routes, sealing compartments, securing control points, and methodically stripping away every option still theoretically available to 200 men, now standing on a brightly lit flight deck with no air cover, no extraction path, no reinforcements on the way, and a growing certainty closing around them from all sides. They have not taken control of a vulnerable ship. They have stepped into the center of a system built to receive them. At 2:31 a.m., deep inside the carrier's combat information center, beneath the flight deck, behind reinforced bulkheads, surrounded by screens that have tracked every phase of the operation since the Cobras first lifted off, the watch officers are not in panic. They never were. The threat boards that turned red at 2:21 a.m. did so because they were meant to. The radar gaps the Quds force analysts spent weeks verifying existed because they had been preserved as gaps. Every piece of information that shaped the Quds force assessment in the weeks before this night, every radar rhythm, every defensive posture, every timing window, had been selected, structured, and fed into place with one purpose: to lead them toward exactly the decision they made tonight. Inside that CIC, they have been watching the entire operation unfold on schedule. That is why they are calm, because nothing that has happened in the last 14 minutes has surprised anyone in that room. At 2:32 a.m., the understanding begins to spread across the flight deck, not all at once, not as one dramatic flash of clarity. It comes the way the worst truths usually arrive in combat, in pieces, each one landing harder than the last. First, the Cobras go silent on the net. Then the speedboats report vessels closing in from several directions at once. Vessels that were not there a minute earlier, or at least had not been seen, now appearing so suddenly it feels as though they have risen straight out of the water. Then the deck lights come on. Then someone looks toward the horizon, catches the outline of an Apache, and knows before his mind fully catches up that the entire geometry of the battle has changed, and changed in a way that cannot be undone. Up to that point, every operator has been running the mission clock in his head. 90 seconds to the aircraft, 60 seconds, almost there. And then that clock stops. Something else takes its place. A colder calculation, a more precise one. The arithmetic of a force that is boxed in, outnumbered, cut off, and standing in full light with nowhere left to move. In just 8 minutes, from 2:22 to 2:30 a.m., the entire shape of the engagement turns inside out. The attackers are now the contained force. The hunters are now the ones being tracked. Every decision the Quds force made, every conclusion drawn from days of close surveillance, every layer of confidence built on intelligence that seemed verified, every tactical choice that appeared disciplined and professional, every one of them had already been anticipated, modeled, and accounted for by the other side. The radar gaps were real. They simply were not accidental. The windows were genuine. They simply were not unprotected. What the analysts believed was a weakness, confirmed over weeks of careful observation, had in fact been created, maintained, and presented with enough consistency to build exactly the level of confidence needed to send 200 elite operators into a boarding action. The intelligence itself had become the weapon. This is the part of modern war that rarely appears in clean diagrams or dramatic retellings, the battle over what the enemy believes to be true. The most decisive weapon in this fight was not the A-10's cannon or the Apache's missiles. It was the image inside the Quds force commander's mind at the moment he gave the order to move. That image had been shaped carefully, patiently, by people who understood his decision-making process well enough to predict not only that he would act, but when he would act, how he would move, and exactly where he would place his men when the moment came. Every piece of intelligence his analysts collected was real. Every gap they confirmed did exist. Every pattern they mapped was genuine. And every one of those details had been arranged by someone else, for someone else's purpose. There is a uniquely devastating kind of professional shock in realizing, at the exact moment that should have been your point of greatest advantage, that the advantage itself was designed by the people you were trying to outmaneuver. That the chain of events bringing you here was not merely foreseen in broad terms, but constructed in precise detail. What that means is even more devastating. Their best analysts, working with maximum care, were not uncovering the truth. They were following a narrative that had been built for them in advance. That is more than a failed mission. It is the collapse of the entire layer of understanding the operation depended on. 200 operators, one flight deck, 8 minutes from insertion to complete containment. The lesson itself is ancient. Sun Tzu understood it, and every serious student of strategy has recognized the same principle ever since. The highest form of victory is not crushing resistance through raw force. It is shaping the fight so completely that the outcome is already leaning in your favor before the first shot is fired. By influencing what the other side believes, what it expects, what it fears, and what it thinks it can achieve. The Quds force did not fail because its men lacked skill. They did not fail because their equipment suddenly stopped working or because their timing fell apart. They failed because the result had effectively been set in motion before the first Cobra ever crossed the horizon. In the weeks beforehand, someone had carefully arranged the battlefield, the signals, and the patterns so that Iran's most capable operators would move willingly, confidently, and at full speed into the exact place where that result could be imposed. The deepest irony in the entire encounter is that the Quds force's greatest strength, their patience, their methodical intelligence work, their discipline to observe, verify, and only then commit, was exactly what made the trap succeed. A less disciplined force might have moved too early before the picture felt complete, before the confidence was fully built. A more impulsive force might have noticed how unnaturally clean those radar gaps looked, sensed that the weakness felt almost too perfect, and pulled back. But a force that was highly trained, highly patient, and operating exactly by its own professional standards, committed fully, precisely as the trap required. That may be the most important strategic lesson hidden inside this entire episode, and it reaches far beyond the Strait of Hormuz, far beyond military operations, into any contest where two intelligent opponents are trying to outthink one another. Your greatest strength, once your opponent understands it deeply enough, can become one of the most precise tools they have against you. The Quds force's discipline was real. Their professionalism was real, their intelligence work was detailed and serious, and every one of those strengths was turned back on them. Not by weakening those qualities, but by giving them exactly the kind of evidence that would cause those qualities to operate at full power. The trap did not succeed in spite of their competence. It succeeded because of it. At 2:30 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, just 8 minutes after the ropes hit the deck, they arrived believing they were about to cripple the carrier's strength. Instead, they found themselves standing inside the very system that had been waiting for them.